Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for being here. The first seminar of semester 2 of the CRCC seminar series from Loughborough University. We're very fortunate to have with us today Professor Anne Warfield-Rawls, who's going to be speaking to us about racism and CA broadly, I think. Really very much looking forward to this talk. A couple of points of housekeeping for you. Anne will speak for between kind of 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So run-of-the-mill stuff at this point, but if you have your microphones on mute during the talk, you should all then be able to unmute yourselves when it comes to questioning. And Anne, I know, is keen as well to see all your faces when the questions come around. So if you want to leave your cameras on for the duration of the talk, or particularly when it ends and turns to the Q&A, that would be wonderful. I think other than that, there's not much to add. When you ask questions, feel free to do so in the chat, or if you use the hand function. I know Teams has recently updated, but it's still an option to do that. Just pop your hand up and I will come to you and we'll field as many questions as we can. If we look like we're going to overrun, I know, Anne, you said you have a little bit of time after 5 o'clock and also can receive questions by email if there's anything pressing. So with that, I will stop talking and I will hand over to Anne.
Okay, I am going to try to keep it shorter than longer, and I'm going to use a PowerPoint here, which there's a new technology for me, so it's going to take me a second to get in here to this. Okay, you seeing that?
Yeah, that's perfect, Anne.
Okay, all right. So I've been giving talks about the Tacit racism book, and I thought for this particular meeting, although I am going to talk about the Tacit racism book, I would start with the graphic from the Black Lives Matter book that
so it's not in the,
that's what I'm
sorry, I
upset
thought it
about.
was.
And that there's no preferences option to turn.
I'm hearing a lot of people talking in the background, so yeah, there we go. This book I edited with Kevin Whitehead and Waverly Duck, and because this is a book about ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, I'm going to start out talking a little bit about that book and using it to frame the discussion of tacit racism. The name of the talk is Revealing Culture as Constitutive Practice, and by titling it that way, by formulating the terms that way, I'm meaning to make a contrast with the way people usually think of culture as beliefs and concepts and values, right? So culture as constitutive practice. EMCA as an unmasking, a revealing of the tacit and take it for granted in interaction orders of tacit racism and other inequalities. My talk will elaborate on what an EMCA approach to interaction orders of tacit racism and inequalities and their trust conditions could look like. And I'm not claiming at this point that we know what it would look like, right? This is something I'm trying to sketch out and needs a lot more research. EM as an approach reveals hidden tacit practices that the excluded know well, because they are revealed by troubles, but that social science typically overlooks. This led to an early focus on troubles in EMCA. And I'm connecting this with the minority status of people who have experiences of trouble that make them aware of trouble. So Garfinkel and Sacks, being Jewish minorities who experience exclusion, becomes an important part of the story. And in the introduction to the Black Lives Matter free book, we talk about that. When looking at race, this is important, as the mainstream view of race, and I didn't use the term white there because the mainstream in different countries is formulated differently, but whatever the mainstream is, that view of race tends to reproduce the perspective of the majority. who do not experience such troubles routinely and consequently have little awareness of the normal taken for granted practices through which people cooperate to create the normal, ordinary order and meaning of social life every day. And by that I mean that for Garfinkel, people who have troubles were considered natural experiments, and they weren't so much interesting in their own right. Of course, they were interesting in their own right, but the big payoff was that by looking at what they understand about the troubles they're having, we get clues that help the rest of us understand how all of social order works, not just, the problems. That race is a social fact, a social category, is also extremely important here. Now, mainstream disciplines have finally started, to accept this idea. But it's a very old one among the authors, that I'm talking about. Du Bois was talking about it in the 1890s. Garfinkel and Sacks are talking about it from the beginning. Because race is a social fact, the processes of its achievement are empirically available, which makes it something that you could study with EMCA. However, understanding those processes and how they create categories and exclusion requires both experience with race that minorities have and an understanding of the history of race categories in any given society as background for looking at talk and interaction. So when I'm talking about race, I'm talking about it in the US. I'm not talking about it in any other country. And the fact that race was invented in the US in the 1600s as a way to control slave labor becomes a very important part of the narrative. And one of the things that I argue in the book, we say a little bit about it in the Black Lives Matter book as well, is that there's a lot of research documenting that race, the way we think of it now as a kind of a biological difference between people, really didn't exist until about 1670s. And that it developed in the US as slaves who had been white became less available as England industrialized. And after the Treaty of Westminster in 1654, England had for the first time direct access to the African slave trade. So African slaves became accessible at just the point where white slaves were suddenly going to be unavailable. Everybody up until that point had been serving periods of time, but later they started calling it indenture. It was never a proper indenture. Black and white served this under the same terms. They were both sold on auction blocks. They were sold repeatedly and regularly. The death rate was extremely high. So there's a kind of a sanitation of what was happening that was invented later in the US to support the false narrative that slavery was about race. So we also have to deconstruct a little bit of that. Without understanding this history of the invention of race and the invention of whiteness in, this from 1670, say, to 1725 in the US, it's not really possible to use the ideas drawn from studies in the US to talk about race in Europe, where that category has developed in conjunction with colonialism. And I've been confronting that problem in some detail because there's a special issue of a European journal that is now being put together where a set of European scholars are commenting on the Tacit racism book. And this, colonialism issue came up right away. And so, the question is, how do you explain what's happening in the US in a way that makes it clear how it's different from colonialism? The US did not have colonies. The US was a colony, right? So the conception of whiteness and blackness in the US doesn't impose an idea that belongs to a colonial people on a colonized people. Whiteness and blackness, in fact, were categories that were used to separate the laboring class, all of whom were oppressed by the wealthy class. So the idea has been exported. People around the world use these terms now, but they can't mean quite the same thing anywhere else that they mean here. So as you hear me talking about whiteness and blackness, keep in mind that this is a particular US category system. Harold Garfinkel, the founder of ethnomethodology, began formal research on race and racism in spring 1940. And I have recently written a quite long description of this in the book that Doug Maynard and John Heritage are publishing. But we also have a summary of it in the Black Lives Matter book, because it was quite a bit of this research from 1940 through 1949. And Harvey Sacks, the founder of conversation analysis, took up the issue of how social categories and membership categorization, as they are used in talk, produce inequality and exclusion in 1962. We review that research in the book, and we also review the papers, efforts by many EMCA scholars who've done research on race and exclusion, examining how racialized categories, stereotypes, and social expectations have become so embedded in tacit, taken for granted aspects of ordinary interaction and conversation that people are not aware of them. And you may have seen on various websites, there are longer lists of papers that we couldn't use in the book because we could only use papers that had a Taylor and Francis copyright. But we have 11 in the book, but there are lots and lots of these, which is really nice to see. My own research is somewhat different from these others. Whereas others have looked at processes related to categories and categorization and their preferences, I have addressed the issue of difference and exclusion at the level of interaction orders and trust conditions. The argument is that centuries of exclusion in the US have resulted in two contrasting interaction orders, one black, one white. And for conceptualizing this, initially I was relying on, in addition to my research, things that Du Bois wrote in the 1880s and 90s about the lack of interaction between black and white. And while he's not known as an interactionist, he addressed interaction directly several times in commenting on how, even though people could be sitting side by side, walking down the same street, sitting on the same bus, there was no communication and no sharing of. He has beautiful descriptions that I can't really mimic, but that there's no sharing of being human beings together, in authentic conversation. So the apartness of these two communication systems, societies, for if it started in 1870, that would be what, 150 years at this point, and likely goes back, another 100 years or so before that. So things like category use are likely also to be different within these interaction orders, but my main focus has been on looking at the interaction orders themselves, on what the preferred basic rules are, right, to use Garfinkel's term, and what their respective trust conditions, which include those basic rules and reciprocities, look like. And I started in the late 1980s with the idea that these must be different, but trying to find it in actual interaction. Garfinkel and Sacks, like Du Bois, this is the argument we're making, had a heightened awareness of racism and exclusion because of their experiences as minorities. And one of the things that we know now, because we've been going through the Garfinkel archive, is that as early as 1960, there are long conversations between Garfinkel and Sacks. And these are in a seminar with Parsons at Harvard. So Parsons is also present. Long conversations about being Jewish and talking about being Jewish in a way that's closely related to the way Garfinkel's been talking about the pre-medical candidate who is Jewish in the early version. And then later how he'll talk about Agnes, that these are people who, if they're trying to assimilate, have limited options, need to pass, right? And they have a particular kind of identity anxiety. And so we can hear them talking about this. And we can also hear them saying that ethnomethodology is a particularly Jewish enterprise because of the insights, because of the experiences of these things that they share and that they don't share with people who haven't, who haven't experienced this exclusion. It's interesting to see Parsons weigh in on that. He's been at these discussions and, he agrees with them. I don't know whether it means he actually understood it. But anyway, it's Du Bois explicitly talks about this in published writings, but Garfinkel and Sacks actually do talk about it in these early tapes, and it comes up later. I've heard Garfinkel talk about it. The tendency of academic disciplines to marginalize minority perspectives then becomes an issue here, right? We know that Garfinkel and Sacks were marginalized. We know that Du Bois was marginalized. The tendency to treat race as a specialty area is also a problem. And it buried the insights of Garfinkel and Sacks, we argue, along with those of Du Bois and other Black sociologists, right? So ethnomethodologists, get to be those, fringy people, right, who make trouble. The remedy in both cases is to build on the work of such marginalized scholars, among whom we include Du Bois, Durkheim, and Goffman, along with Garfinkel and Sacks and Shegloff and Jefferson, and of course others, Egon Bittner, right, who are all Jewish. Having these conversations to try to bring their contributions to the center of their disciplines, where we argue they belong. So the mainstream disciplines have been operating on the basis of majority insights from the beginning. When minority scholars come up with brilliant, insightful new things, they inspect their own experience and they say, there's nothing like that in my life. So, obviously they're wrong to making it up. And they just proceed. And so bringing not just ethnomethodology, right, not just studies of transgender and, the other thing, that category work and so on, but bringing all of it to the center and redefining what, not just sociology, but what mainstream disciplines are, because they all need to recenter these awarenesses. It's a ethnomethodological fundamental that those who experience trouble hold the key to understanding society. And I'm just trying to underline how important that makes minority scholars and minority experiences, and how much we need to be paying attention. we, majority scholars. Okay, so the overall framework, interaction orders, and they're in my dissertation too, but I'm citing my published work here, are shared expectations for making social facts grounded in trust conditions. And with Garfinkel, the first trust paper is really 1952, but again, I'm giving the published date. So building on Du Bois, we, and in this case, it's Waverly Duck and myself in the book Tacit Racism, identify interaction orders of race. The first one, the black-white introductory sequences, is in my 2000, but that's the wrong citation for the other two. It should say Rawls and Duck 2020 for the fractured reflections and non-recognition and submissive civility in everyday interaction. We argue that the solution is developing a heightened consciousness of race interaction troubles through EMCA that we call a white double consciousness. In other words, after methodology and conversation analysis can make mainstream people have the experience of trouble that Du Bois called double consciousness, and we're arguing that this was what Garfinkel was, and Sacks, although Sacks also had a different agenda in terms of a theory of language, but that they were trying to offer sociology a way to get this heightened awareness. Now, I'm probably only going to have time to talk about the first of these, white people are nosy. I will save the other two for questions because I think it's fun to answer questions. So I'll just go through this first one and then just quickly summarize the other two. We heard, I had a research team at Wayne State University. We heard Black Americans repeating this narrative about white people. White people are nosy, right? And I wondered what it could mean. White people are nosy. And one of the things I did with this was just to repeat it to Black people, white people in classes, white people are nosy. And I quickly discovered that Black people all knew what it meant. They would laugh, they could tell me a story. It works like Garfinkel's coat hanger. So if you tell a Black person white people are nosy, they can tell you a story. If you tell a white person white people are nosy, they would just give you a look like you were crazy. What could it mean? They didn't know. So I collected lots of narratives and then figured out how to make transcripts to, get people actually talking so that I could record it and see how these different stories would play out in an actual interaction. It turned out to be quite simple. If I stuck with the beginnings, white people are nosy, comes up in a number of different ways. But one of the primary ways that it comes up is that when Black and white Americans first meet, they have different ways of establishing identity and meaning. Now, because I'm speaking, to people who are also in England and Europe, white Americans don't have the same expectations as Europeans. And I've often been told by Europeans, yeah, we think Americans are nosy. Black Americans turn out to be more like Europeans, right? So this can be confusing in international talks because the race positions not only don't match, they seem to flip over. And the reasons for the expectations in Europe and England are different from what they are in the United States. So, we need to focus on the US Black-white binary, where it comes from, and what could be going on in these contrasting introductory sequences. So a typical white introductory sequence, which I'm not going to show you transcript of, I'm only going to show the black one, Exchanges questions. These are the things Black people call nosy questions. You know, what's your name, your occupation, where do you live, what's your education, are you married, do you have kids, you know, and within a minute, white Americans, you know, can go through all of these. And if you do a role play, and I've done a lot of them, and you say, introduce yourselves to each other, they just jump right into it. You don't have to tell them what to do. They just go for it. Black introductory sequences don't do this. So when I would do these role plays in class, and I would put two Black students up and say, okay, do an introductory sequence like the white kids just did. They would say, we can't. Or they would say, where are we? Right? Now, I don't have to tell the white kids where they are, but the Black students want to know where they are. So I could say the same thing I'd said for the white students. You're in a line waiting to pick up your pizza, you know, in the cafeteria at Little Caesars, because at Wayne in the student cafeteria, they had that. And they would say, we can't talk there. We can't do it there. You know, so even trying to get them to enter into the role play, I got a lot of information. Most of what I asked the white students to do, they would say they couldn't do. They needed a place in which, as Black speakers, it would be normal and natural to actually introduce themselves to a stranger, and there just weren't very many where they felt comfortable doing it. Now, this was back when people had to line up to get into classes in person, so you were physically present in a line. You might be in for a couple of hours, so they suggested that one. So we use that for some of the role plays. You're in this line, you're waiting, you know, to sign up, and then they could find some things to talk about. And you know, I got the idea how it was they were orienting the things that they could say. So they're orienting toward what is in the immediate environment. They could ask each other if they were carrying books. Oh, I see you have a chemistry book. I took chemistry. Do you like it? Right? What they're apparently doing is organizing their interactional expectations so that they are avoiding category information. They're taking their turns differently. They're self-disclosing rather than asking questions more often. They're focusing on things, not just topics, but things like a book somebody might be carrying that is present in the interaction. And that by doing this, they have an interaction order of expectations that offers some equality, right? That the broader public, you know, society is assaulting them every day with inequalities, and yet within this Black interaction order, they're able to offer each other this oasis of equality. So I just have one transcript to try to give people who are not familiar with this some idea of what this kind of thing looks like. And I picked this transcript because it also, on the second page, has a problem, right, where category information does come up. And so I want to talk about how that is in fact treated as a problem when it happens. So there are two Black women who I call Rita and Tanya, and they're in a room which I had at Wayne State that I used for my research, and it's got video cameras, and they have, you know, they're from sociology classes, they're getting extra credit. You know, they sign release forms. They don't know each other. That's the main thing. They had to not know each other. I did it with pairs of white women. I did it with pairs of Black women, and I tried not to mix gender because there are lots of ways that flirting and, you know, other kinds of things that work by gender can throw the rest of the stuff off. So I told them to sit there and get to know each other. You see my first two lines. So Rita says, okay, and Tanya says, okay. And then Rita says hello. Now, these are self-disclosures, right? They're not asking, they're saying, hello. Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm Rita. How are you doing? Fine. How are you? Okay, so the how are you looks pretty typical, but for both black and white. But those are sort of pro forma. All right. Now, Rita is going to choose something from the environment to talk about. And she's going to talk about the research project. I'm curious as to what this questions that we're doing. And Tanya says, what's this interview about? And Rita says, I don't know. And Tanya says, oh. And then Rita says, I don't know either. And they laugh together. Then they recycle, a similar set of terms. What they got the tape on, we're being filmed in audio and video. Oh, like we on TV, he. And again, there's laughter. Tanya says, how are they supposed to stop us if they're not in here? Rita says, a lady came in and just started it, so I assume that's how she wants it to be. Then Tanya asks a question. It's not really a category question because she signed a thing that's told her that only people in the class are doing this experiment. So with that as background, it's really more like checking. It's a safe question. You in this class? Uh-huh. Oh, okay. Then Rita self-discloses. Well, this is my first year at school. It's cool. And Tanya queries that. Really? Rita says, uh-huh. Now Tanya is asking a category question. Age, you just graduated high school? Rita says, no, please, girl, I'm 29. I'm almost 29. And Tanya said, oh, I was about to say. And Rita says, I'll be 29 in 2 days. Now, what's happened there is that she's 29. She doesn't look 18. So when she said it was her first year at school, she made the way she looked sitting there in that situation a discrepancy with what she was saying. And so that discrepancy could be queried because it's right there in the situation. So it does get queried. But then at the end of it, Tanya says, oh, okay, I blew that one huge. And there's nervous laughter. So even though it was made relevant in the situation, and Rita's not complaining about it, Tanya is providing an apology of sorts there. Rita goes, mm-hmm. And Tanya asks her one more question. What, you was going somewhere else? And Rita says, no, this is nowhere else. This is my freshman year. And that's it. It gets dropped. Now they keep talking. I'm not going to show any more transcript, but this just dies right there. It gets this one follow-up question. And then they continue to do talk about, what's going on in the room and what's going on in the research project. All right. Fractured reflections. I'm just going to do quickly here. This is taking Goffman and Cooley and Garfinkel and Sacks and dealing with it all together. That when people make self-presentations in interaction, then there are turns that follow where the people who are responding to them don't respond to their self-presentations in the expected way. So we're studying a particular high status Black men, and they don't get treated like high status Black men who've just said things to people who need to take it into account. We talk about, there being a gestalt, which Joe Fagan calls a white racial frame. People don't expect Black men to have high status. And it came to our attention both because Waverly and I, this is Waverly's, Waverly and I were both present when it happened to him. We spent about 10 years trying to figure out what we'd seen and collecting data and figuring it out. So this one was a long time coming. In the process, we discovered that Black men actually sit around and talk about this because it's such an ever present, problem for them. Submissive civility was entirely Waverly's idea. Du Bois has an argument that Black Americans are more democratic than white Americans, and that their ideal of a man who is, he uses the term man, so I'm using it, a man who is submissive to the good of the whole is a very important democratic ideal that contrasts with what he calls the white strongman ideal. And this is Trump, right? I do what I want to do. I don't care how many people it hurts. And we, he didn't talk about it in interaction. So we were asking, what would this look like in interaction if Black people, and particularly Black men, are really adopting this submissive posture? Could we find it in interaction, and could we see the kinds of troubles that it's producing? It involves an exaggerated temporary conformity to white expectations. It's a response to oppression, but as Du Bois said, it's also a democratic and equalizing posture. As a white person, I had a lot of trouble with submission. I didn't want to call it submission. So over the years since we've been writing about this, I've become much more comfortable with that. But for a white American, submission means weakness, right? And so it did mean that to Du Bois, and it apparently doesn't mean that to Black men and women. So we did this in CA, a very complicated CA analysis of long transcriptions of white police officer, Black male encounters. And we try to show that police officers are treating submissive, compliant behavior as suspicious, and then show how they end up getting, beaten up and arrested because police officers can't figure out how to think of it any other way as suspicious. And of course, they might just want to be finding something suspicious, but either way, it's usable, it's accountable in their way of thinking about things. And again, stories about these circulate widely in the Black community, so you can collect narratives about this problem. So I'm done. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I have to turn my camera back on because it gets automatically turned off. It's not, oh, I have to get out of that, right? And then I have to turn my camera back on. Okay.
Perfect. It all worked. We got there in the end. Thank you ever so much, Anne, for a fascinating talk. I'm certain that we will have some questions from our audience. So we encourage you either to just pop your hand up and we'll come to you. You can ask those on screen, or if you can't come on screen for any reason, just pop it in the chat and we'll field those too. Saul.
Hi, Anne. Thank you very much for that talk. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Early on in the talk, you mentioned reading and listening to lots of Sacks and Garfinkel's conversations about Jewishness, how it informed their understanding of ethnomethodology. And I was just curious if they talk at all about the legal training or any of the kind of the traditions such as data sessions. And this is just coming from a conversation I had with Jean Lerner some time ago. About the similarity of the data session to the Chavrusa, which is the sort of Talmudic discussion group. And I'm just curious if you've come across any of that kind of thing.
Let me first say that we got stopped a little bit by COVID. I had a team over here and we were getting ready to post all this stuff. We do have a website almost ready so that, people will be able to come in and listen to these things. But the team got grounded in Germany, and the physical things are over here. So within another couple of months, I'll have the team back together and we'll be able to post it. So one of the things, the main thing, the focus of what Garfinkel and Sacks are talking about in 1960, and again in another discussion in 1964, is the difficulty of being, it's not that they're trying to assimilate, although they're talking about assimilation, but they're talking about being in the Jewish community, what it is that other Jewish people think counts. So they're not talking about trying to be Jewish, which would be talking about those, kinds of Talmudic discussions. They're talking about the pressure to assimilate. So Sacks says, for my father, the only thing that counts is being a doctor. Now, we already know at that point, right, he's got his JD. So what he's saying is, nothing I've done as a lawyer counts. For my father, I'm nobody, right? I'm still a Jew, you see. And so he talks about the biblical story of Job, as being a particularly Jewish narrative about the kinds of, experiences he's describing that he has, and he's contrasting them with Christian forms of narrative. But it's for Garfinkel earlier, he does this in 1948, in his first versions of his dissertation. And Jason Turwitz and I published a paper, so we got a lot of quotes from that even before the website's up. But he's looking at a paper by Sartre, who's talking about assimilation, right? And so the question is, does the identity anxiety that being forced to assimilate produce account for a lot of these troubles? And he uses the same language there as he does later with Agnes. It's a person who's being forced to judge their actions on the basis of standards they don't understand and don't know. And so this identity anxiety is creating, he's describing cognitive dissonance, right? Because you really don't know what the standards are, you don't know what the rules are, you have to let other people judge your behavior in order to assimilate. You're kind of shooting at a target, that you can't see, and you don't understand the rules for the contest. I have recently written a couple of things where I've said, I think it explains the vulnerability of a lot of Americans to conspiracy theory right now. But saying that requires also understanding something Du Bois said about the Black American experience, that because Black Americans couldn't assimilate and aren't trying for the most part, they are creating for each other a community in which they can confirm each other's realities. So they're not actually suffering from this identity anxiety. But because Jews could assimilate, and because working class white people were trying to be rich white people, they actually are, I think, suffering from this identity anxiety. And that's why we've got all this crazy conspiracy theory stuff. So,
thank you, Timothy.
Yes, thanks, and wonderful talk. I'm so glad that you mentioned the Sacks stuff on the story of Job. I think, as you mentioned that, I'm remembering going back into the Sacks archives at UCLA, and there's a notebook where he goes on for several pages deconstructing that story, the story of Job. And I'm thinking I think there's maybe a lot to be said in terms of his discussion of that, and this whole discussion of race and being an outsider, all of that. There's a whole theme there. So I'd be interested if you wanted to expand on that a little bit more. And then as a side note, I'll just toss this out to you. While you were talking, it was reminding me of a lecture that Wynton Marsalis gave at Harvard, where he was talking about jazz as a small d democratic conversation. And it's quite insightful. And Marsalis has this ability to talk about the concrete realities of making jazz improvisational music, and talk about it in this way where he's really conveying the conversational character of it in a way that we would appreciate as conversation analysts. I mean, very, very much the back and forth, the turn taking, the finishing someone else, all of that. So anyways, a little bit more on the biblical criticism that Sacks was working on in this theme. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. We have, a draft of a paper where we're trying to actually work it into a discussion of the idea of culture in terms of constitutive practice, right? That was in the title. I'm not sure I understand it very well. I feel the way I did when I was first doing White People Are Nosy, right? So I'm not sure that I can explain it yet. I can hear what he's saying, that there's something about the orientation of a Jewish person toward time, even, right, toward the present as opposed to the future, that there's something about Christianity and its future orientedness, right, and that you don't know what a life amounted to until you see what happens after you die. He talks about that a lot. But as you're suggesting with the jazz comparison with Sacks, it's always important to remember that he's talking about things like the quality of the present interaction and how it's being affected by that, right? So while I can hear him saying these things, that sort of sound abstract and theoretical, I also know from listening to Sacks that there's nothing abstract and theoretical about this. He's, going to bring it down to concrete particulars. And in the discussions we have, it may be there, and I may just not understand it yet, but I would suggest that, notes like that at UCLA, which we don't have, should be paired with, because we've got a half-hour discussion from 1960, we've got a shorter one from 1964. And in 1964, he's had the Suicide Prevention Center data, and he's really arguing for focusing on terms at that point. And he's still insisting that this Job narrative is an important part of, how he's thinking about how that's happening. So I can't tell you what it means. I don't know. I'm hoping to know, and I'm hoping to figure out how to figure that out. And I'd like the Wynton Marsalis reference, because one of the things that we see happening in Black conversation, which is like jazz, is that there's no preset, format, right? I mean, people can just equally participate. I mean, it's set up so that the 1/3 of the Black male population that's been in prison never gets outed in a Black conversation, right? It's entirely egalitarian. And white music is, structured, and there are parts, and some instruments are more important than other instruments. And, unless the conductor writes a solo, for one of the instruments that doesn't usually get more exposure, then they're in the background. So I think Black music is probably doing something that's similar. Again, I don't know enough about music, but if he's written that out, there might be a way to use that, at least to draw some parallels.
I'll send you the reference, and for everyone else's benefit, if you're curious, if you just Google Wynton Marsalis, Harvard lecture, jazz as a democratic conversation. I can put it in the chat thing too. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Do we have any further questions? I don't see anything in the chat at the minute, but pop anything in or pop your hand up if you do have.
While we're waiting for a question, I would also say that there are a couple of artists who've said things that are similar and that I've tried to use. Hans Hofmann is one, and now I'm blanking. Robert Henry is the other one. You know, in talking about how it is that their paintings are it's not quite interactionally structured, but they're coming really close to that. And it sounds, you know, very ethnomethodological, just as long as we're talking about music.
Whilst we're waiting on more questions, I know, Anne, you mentioned that in terms of the time window you had, you were just going to show us the one example. Is there a taste of the differences in the other examples in terms of participants and findings that you could maybe just?
Yeah, the last one, the middle one, the fractured reflections, we rarely did extended interviews. And so what we have there is long narratives that we use. But for the submissive civility, we, and that one, the long version was published in Community and, I can't think of the name of the journal. It's an ASA journal, Community, and anyway, we have a chapter in the Tacit Racism book. It's a very shortened version for the Community and Society, I don't know, journal. We did a very long transcript. And Jason Turowitz did, you know, took the lead on doing a turn-by-turn CA analysis of where the troubles were happening, and then looking for how it was that these submissively civil postures were happening, you know, right before those troubles. So we try in that one to do a very careful job of tracking through a transcript how this mismatch of expectations is showing up. It's very complicated, so you know it would be impossible to do in the time. But for people who are interested, I think if you did my name and Jason's name and, you know, black-white police interaction, the journal would, City and Community, that's what it's called. It's in City and Community, and it came out, I think, in 2019, you know, so it's a very recent one. You know, we talked a little bit about what had happened at Starbucks, because that had happened as we were writing the paper. The problem is most of the very famous shootings and, you know, illegal use of force cases that we have video for are very short. And in order to do a proper CA analysis, not just of, you know, a few turns, but where we're trying to make an argument about a mismatch in how they're actually constructing, you know, their objects and what their expectations for what should come next are, you really need a long piece. And this was 16 minutes. And so, you know, it's extremely rare to have a 16-minute piece. It was available on the internet, so we don't have the whole thing in the paper, but you can go find it. There had also been a public meeting where the police officers have been fired. The city council had apologized to the black man who'd been arrested. You know, so we knew what the outcome was. It had been public enough so that writing about it wasn't jeopardizing anybody who wasn't already in the news, you know. So there were a lot of reasons why that became the piece that we used. You know, but the fact that the police officer, the white police officer, just keeps saying, you know, first he's saying, you're resisting me. And the only way that this guy is resisting is in the turn structure. And he actually makes these complaints at those places. And then he will say, you know, this is suspicious. Why are you saying this? When what this man is doing is what we've described as submissively civil behavior. It's not what you would expect a white man to do. You'd expect a white man to get angry, you know, and say, I live here, go away, what are you doing? And he never does that. You know, he says, I can prove I live here. He says, let's go talk to my neighbors. You know, he does things that go, as we say, above and beyond you know, what's required, and the police treat this as suspicious. So the, you know, the CA analysis tries to track that it's at those points where he's doing things we're calling submissively civil, that, you know, you're getting trouble markers. And then the bigger issue is to try to convey, to make sense of the fact that this submissive civility really is a thing that Black people recognize and know that they're doing. When I talked about it early on, and I would say, I'm sorry, it's called submissive, but, you know, and students would say to me, hey, now you're being really white, right? Because this is actually a good thing, being submissively civil. And, you know, when you don't like calling it that, you're showing the cultural prejudice. So it's been really interesting to experience that, even as I try to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to Saul, who's posted the reference for that paper in the chat.
Good, thank
you. We actually have an interesting observation here, maybe just to round us out, from Mirko, who says, more of an observation about the Black-white ways of speaking. I found this very interesting and reflected in seeing how my best friend, dark-skinned Mexican living in Boston, has spoken to white people in a particular way that clearly establishes his credentials, at least so that he isn't assumed to be a janitor.
Yeah, quite necessary, and something he would not do, when he was talking to a community of equals, right? And again, that one was hard for me. You know, I had a lot of Black students as I was doing this research, and I kept saying, but that's not what we're doing. We're not doing inequality. And they would say, oh, yes, you are. Come on. It took me a long time to realize. And I started out saying, you know, white people do it one way, Black people do it another. We don't need to change. We just need to understand the difference. Now I'm realizing, no, some of these mainstream white ways of doing things are oppressive and they need to stop.
Right, absolutely. That brings us neatly to 5 o'clock. So I think it just remains for us to thank everybody for attending, and particular thanks to you, Anne, for your time. There we go. Oh, who knows? You can clap on Teams now. I didn't know that, but there we are. So thank you ever so much.
Okay. Well, it's really nice to see you all in your little circles.
I'm not sure we've converted you to Teams, but we really appreciate your steadfast efforts to get to grips with it all. So I think Anne has said, if questions arise as a result of what you've heard today, please do feel free to drop her an email. And there's a link to her faculty profile on our webpage. Thanks in the comments as ever. And happy Friday. Have a good weekend, everybody. And many thanks again to you, Anne.
Yeah. And if you don't have the free book, it's free, you know.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.